Heinrich Himmler, one of the key leaders of the Nazi Party. He started off as a very unimaginative child and turned into a man who became the architect of evil. This is the life of Heinrich Himmler. Welcome to Weird and Wonderful History, where I bring you all the weird and the wonderful stories throughout history. I am your host, Gabrielle McMaster, and in this episode we are going to take it slightly differently and look at the life of someone who has caused a lot of fascination throughout history, Heinrich Himmler. As a historian, I think it is key to firstly look at this fascination that people have with the Nazis and the Nazi leaders. Historians have often said that this fascination is because of our interest in human nature or humanity itself. Yet this side of that interest and that fascination, it's not similar to, for example, our fascination with human nature in the aspect of the Titanic, where we are interested in the humanity behind the tragedy, the people, the stories, and their fight for survival, and what it must have been like to experience such a tragedy. In terms of our fascination with the Nazis, this stems from an interest in human nature and how humans can turn so inherently evil to other human beings. In essence, it is us trying to understand the incomprehensibility of how someone could agree with the Holocaust or even accept that other human beings are lesser race to them. And for us, that is the heart of where our fascination with the Nazis really comes from. And in this episode, I want to really strip that back, and I want to look at the life of Heinrich Himmler and how this fascination with the Nazis leads to us trying to work out where this inherent evilness really came from throughout his life. From a very early age, Himmler had quite an influence from his father. Himmler was sent to a grammar school in northeast of Munich, and this was where his father was the joint schoolmaster, and this began his influence with his father. From a very young age, Himmler took quite an interest in the Germanic heritage and history. Alongside this, he started to take an interest in the historical memorabilia of his father's, and his father went to every possible length to encourage Himmler in this fascination. Despite all of this, Himmler was known to be quite a hard-working and methodical child, and despite being quiet and unimaginative, he was very proper and organised. And we do see this through Himmler's later work at these barbaric operations that he organised. They are meticulously organised down to a T, and this is something that Himmler's always had. This is a skill he has forever had, that he eventually used for evil. At the outbreak of World War I, this is where we start to see this change in Himmler. He is no longer simply this hard-working and methodical child. He is now starting to turn his attention more towards war and fighting in battles. Himmler started to read about battles and events that he read in newspapers, and he starts to actually write this down in a diary. Again, that methodical organisation comes in again. His father started to receive letters from Prince Heinrich, who had joined the army in 1901 as a lieutenant, and Himmler was taking these letters and he was reading them and meticulously writing down the details in this diary again, alongside the details of the battles that were taking place. Prince Heinrich was eventually wounded in action on the Western Front in 1914, and Himmler details this to extensiveness in his diary. And despite having this influence of Prince Heinrich and knowing that he was badly wounded, this did not stop Himmler from preparing himself to join the German army. He was exercising regularly and he was lifting weights to try and gain some muscle. As much as Himmler tried to portray himself as this strong and youthful German who was ready to fight for the army, he actually ended up getting very regular colds and stomach pains and various other illnesses as well. And these were constantly frustrating for him because this prevented him from not only getting stronger, but also from going into the army. All of this was going to change for Heinrich following the death of his godfather, Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, in 1916. In 1917, his father's reaction to the death of Prince Heinrich became very much apparent through him writing to the Bavarian royal household asking for Himmler to be considered as a future officer cadet. However, while this was a massive feat for Himmler to finally be offered this opportunity, he was not allowed to be given it before he reached maturity. And during this time between waiting for this and getting to be an officer cadet, Himmler was called up for training in 1917 in his mother's hometown with the 11th Bavarian Infantry Regiment. Once he was called up in 1917, Himmler continued his army training for the next year. He first trained as a machine gunner, and then he later had the opportunity to train as an officer, the one thing his father wanted for him in the passing of his godfather. And while we know that later Himmler claimed to have seen so much action on the Western Front, this just was not true. In World War I, the records from this time actually show that Himmler never finished his army training before the end of World War I. He was discharged in December 1918 without completing his officer training course. The war finished before Himmler had a chance to even fight, and this was something that Himmler throughout his life made him at more of a disadvantage than those other Nazi leaders around him who would have seen action. And this is probably where this claim of seeing the action on the Western Front probably came from. After this, any hope of military service was further diminished in the aftermath of the reductions to the German military under the Treaty of Versailles. And this was also because of the country's horrific economy that had just been decimated as a consequence of World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, and paying war reparation payments. Even though Himmler had intended to continue to follow through on his father's expectations for him in the military, he was forced to seek employment in a civilian position. And again, this was not what Himmler wanted. The events that took place after the war ended really made Himmler feel like he was at a disadvantage compared with his counterparts in the Nazi Party later on in life. He had not only been disadvantaged in terms of military service, but he was now disadvantaged by being in an employment position that he really did not wish to be in. If you have watched Man in the High Castle, then you might remember the snide remark that John Smith makes to the future Heinrich Himmler. John Smith calls him a failed chicken farmer, and at the time this was very much a laughable conversation. However, this was pretty much accurate, and in fact, when Himmler has to go and get employment, he is employed on a chicken farm. And this was actually in the city of Ingolstadt, where his father took up a teaching position in 1919. And again, we have his father's influence once again prevailing in Himmler's life. While he was on the farm, Himmler fell very ill and was eventually diagnosed with typhoid fever. He was told to stay very much clear of farm work for at least 1 year, even though we do have that little snide remark in Man in the High Castle that a lot of people did find funny and was eventually taken up as, yes, that was pretty much correct. Himmler did feel as a chicken farmer, he fell ill, he couldn't continue his employment, but in Himmler's life he was very ambitious, and farming was something he was ambitious in. Himmler wanted to achieve a career in farming, so much so that he enrolled himself on an agricultural course in the Technical University of Munich in October 1919. In this course he sought to study the crops and soil types, and he stayed here until 1922. During this time Himmler became ambitious in other fields as well. He joined the fencing fraternity, and he even received a badge of honour, which was a fencing scar on his face, and this was something that he wore proudly throughout his life. This ambition in farming and now in fencing almost became overshadowed by Himmler's time as a student, because while he was studying agriculture and enjoying fencing, he also spent a large time in a student society, and this was named the Apollo Club. This club was largely full of ex-soldiers and top graduates, whose president was actually a Jewish man named Abraham Hofner. And Himmler was known to have been very polite to all the Jewish members in public. But it was very clear in these early days that he was starting to become very anti-Semitic, as he was involved in a lot of violent arguments at which he was protesting against their membership in the Apollo Club. And eventually, throughout this club and the university, he earned himself a reputation of quite a nationalistic militarist, and this was not a good reputation for Himmler to have. At this point, we can presume that some of the ex-soldiers had been Jewish. Due to this, Himmler already has quite a lot of aggravation and frustration towards ex-soldiers due to the fact he wasn't one, and he had such a desire to be one. This is zero excuse for his anti-Semitism, but a little bit like Hitler, that anti-Semitism had to come from somewhere. And this is where we see it coming from. It's stemming from the fact that in this club of ex-soldiers, he was seeing Jewish men that had been soldiers over him, and he did not like this one bit. Accounts from students at the time portrayed Himmler to be quite a pedantic and morally upright young man. He took his studies of agriculture extremely seriously, as well as his church going. And for some of us that can look in hindsight at what Himmler eventually became, the idea of him being a strong churchgoer is quite paradoxical to the pagan nature that he took and the pagan nature that he caused men in the SS to come under as well. Yet alongside this, he was still very much interested and very proud of the Germanic culture and traditions that he grew up with and that he was very fascinated with from a young age. At this stage, we can see that Himmler's fascination with Germanic culture and his moral duty to attend and worship at church can almost be seen later in his life coming together to form what he did with the SS, which we will discuss later. Alongside this ironic nature of Himmler being such a good churchgoer and turning pagan, we also see him alongside this refusing to be intimate with any young women. In fact, it is known that he told his brother that he intended to remain a virgin until his wedding night. And this could have been due to his very strict church-going, morally upright duty, or we can see this as sort of ironic in the fact of the Lebensborn program that he invented, whereby young German men were impregnating young women regardless of who they were married to or if they weren't married, to fuel the German race. And again, this is where people like Himmler become fascinating to us as humans, because we see such a change in his life once he gets into the Nazi party. We can already start to see the little holes being formed, such as in the Apollo Club and his argument with Jewish ex-soldiers. In terms of his morals, aside from that, we don't overly see that. And this is where we are going to start taking a deep dive into Himmler's life more when he gets into the Nazi party, to see where these changes come in. The next massive event in Himmler's life that leads to him becoming the leader of the SS is when he meets Ernest Rohm. On the 25th of January 1922, at a meeting of his rifle club, Himmler comes into contact with Ernest Rohm, and Himmler is immediately encapsulated by Rohm, because Rohm was able to remain as an officer in the German army after World War I. At the time, Himmler described him as being friendly but pessimistic about communism, and communism was becoming quite rife in Bavaria at the time. They were looking for a solution to the problem that was caused by the First World War, and again, this is where the Nazi parties come in. In essence, with humans, when things start to go wrong, we take the extremes. So we'll either go to the extreme left or the extreme right, and there'll be no in between. And this is simply because these people on the extremes offer solutions that we cannot possibly turn down. And this is what happens in the 1920s and 1930s in Germany. The extreme left are the communists. The extreme right will end up being the Nationalist Socialist Party, better known as the Nazi Party. This meeting between Himmler and Ernest Rohm becomes the first sign of Himmler being involved or interested in organised nationalistic politics. He was so greatly impressed by Rohm, and of course this started him on the path of becoming involved in the Nazi Party. Once he finished his agricultural studies, which was in August 1922, Himmler and his brother Gerhard joined Rohm's nationalistic paramilitary unit. This was known as the Imperial War Flag Society, and this was seen in early 1923. So already before the Wall Street crash even happens, which causes this fall in the economy and the Great Depression, we see Himmler already veering towards the extreme right in history. However, this didn't change his prospects with employment. In fact, Himmler sought to get some form of employment once he left university. Himmler eventually got a job as a fertilizer laboratory assistant in a town just north of Munich. And this is quite interesting for where he picked his employment, because it was just close enough that he could still continue his membership of Rohm's Flag Society. Around about the years that we are already discussing with Himmler, it is important to note that the German Workers' Party was starting to gain quite a bit of influence, and this was based in Munich. And as of July 1921, the German Workers' Party, or DAP, was led by Adolf Hitler. The National Socialist German Workers' Party was gaining a lot of influence in Munich at the time, that it would have been hard to believe that Himmler never once caught on to their influence or their ideals during this time. While the DAP was gaining influence in Munich, within Germany in the wider sphere, the nationalists were gaining a lot of momentum and growth. With hyperinflation happening in 1923, this fueled this growth even further. The French occupation of the Ruhr in 1922, when they seized large amounts of German industrial output, including coal, fueled the extreme sides that humans would go to. So essentially, once the French took this in place of their lack of reparation payments, people were starting to seek an answer from the communists or the nationalists due to trying to get a solution to this. Hyperinflation caused discontentment and unemployment on top of the situation in the Ruhr, and this caused the growth to happen. But at the same time, it also led to even more unrest and fights in the streets of Germany. At this stage, the Bavarian nationalist societies agreed to transfer all of their power in their organisations to Hitler's. And this included Rohm's Flag Society. The idea behind this was to strengthen the forces, to try and attract more people in and exponentially grow the nationalists in Germany. And this eventually formed the Kampfbund in the 25th of September 1923, and this is the first change we see happening towards the Nazi Party itself. Despite Hitler taking over all of these other groups, Himmler was still in Rohm's group, and therefore he was a subordinate to Rohm. This is something we really need to remember as we go into how Himmler took charge of the SS. Yet it was Himmler's involvement in Rohm's group that allowed him to take part in Hitler's beer hall putsch. The beer hall putsch was the whole NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And Himmler was arrested in the beer hall putsch, along with Rohm and Hitler. But, unlike those two, Himmler was released due to the fact there was very little evidence to suggest he had been involved in the beer hall putsch. Himmler's arrest meant that he lost his job as a fertilizer laboratory assistant due to his involvement in the putsch. And when the National Socialist German Workers' Party and the SA were banned, he was forced to return home to his parents. He had absolutely no motivation and nothing to really keep him going anymore. Eventually, in February 1924, Himmler went to visit Rohm in prison, and Himmler continued to remain in contact with Rohm while he was incarcerated. A lot of people question, when they look at the Nazis' rise to power, how Hitler managed to do this so well. And it really starts with Hitler seeking peaceful means of taking power. And this was a decision that he made while incarcerated. It gave him a lot of time to think about how to achieve his ultimate aim of being dictator of Germany. Rohm was then needed to try to reform all of these paramilitary groups with a view of seizing power eventually by force. And this is where the peaceful means work alongside the forcefulness to gaining power. Yet, while this seemed almost the correct way to do it due to the situation in Germany at the time, this actually created a rift between Rohm and Hitler. Rohm viewed Hitler as being very weak in deciding to take power by peace, and he actually resigned from all party commitments on the 1st of May 1925. Despite Rohm and Himmler's very close friendship and partnership in the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Himmler had zero intention of giving up his political activities, as he refused to look for employment. Instead, he actually campaigned for the newly formed National Socialist Freedom Movement. And for those listening, you will probably already guess that was just a different name for the NSDAP, or the German Workers' Party. With his campaigning, Himmler went into towns and villages in Bavaria to make speeches about the evils of the Jews and the capitalism. When Rohm left Germany for Bolivia, Himmler was left without any powerful friend to influence him or help him achieve his goal of campaigning, and he couldn't be known to anyone powerful without Rohm, and this caused an issue for Himmler. Once Hitler was released from prison, it really breathed new life into this party, into the NSDAP, or now it was known as the National Socialist Freedom Movement. With Hitler being released from prison and now taking charge again, Himmler decided to rejoin the new party on the 22nd of August 1925. After rejoining the party, Himmler is now 24 years old, but we see him starting to try to work out how to climb this leadership ladder within the party. We see this when Himmler joins the staff of Gregor and Otto Strasser, and he joins them as a general assistant. Eventually, Himmler made himself indispensable to Gregor Strasser. Otto Strasser later recalled how Himmler was doubly useful as he also had a motorbike. He used this idea of rapid transport to be placed in charge of checking the various arms dumps the Nazi Party had built around Bavaria itself. This was to ensure that the arms dumps were not discovered by the government, and yet that also gave Himmler a sense of authority and responsibility for something so precious in the party. While Himmler assisted in the party organisation within Lower Bavaria during 1925, he also made himself useful by helping to edit the party's local journal, in which he said, in his own words, he named and shamed all Jewish persons living in Bavaria, along with those who he judged, rightly or wrongly, to be their friends. And this led some within the party to question whether Himmler was becoming obsessed with the Jews. And again, this brings us back to this anti-Semitism that was first seen in the Apollo Club. This is where we start to see Himmler building upon his anti-Semitism even further. And this once again is pushing him more towards becoming that architect of evil. Gregor Strasser eventually gets into the mix when he hears about this. And he tells people that he had no intention of giving Himmler a promotion, as he thought that Himmler, although he was ambitious, was no world beater. And despite this, and despite Strasser saying this, Himmler's diligence eventually did earn him a promotion, and he became Strasser's deputy within Bavaria, shortly after Strasser said this in response to Himmler naming and shaming all of these Jews. Alongside him starting to climb up the Bavarian ladder of leadership, he then starts to divert his attention to the SS, or the Schutzstaffel. And it was around the same time that Himmler decided to join what was known at the time as quite an obscure bodyguard unit within the party. And this, of course, was the Schutzstaffel, or the SS. And this was more or less a formation of the latest in a succession of personal bodyguard units to Hitler, or the Führer as he was starting to be called at this time. The SS were formed out of Hitler's idea of an elite personal protection unit amongst the ranks of the SA. And this idea of Hitler started to be formed because of his paranoia, which is something that Himmler uses to his advantage later on. But Hitler's paranoia gave him worry that he would be involved in some of the many hundred political assassinations that were happening within Germany after World War I. The SS were disbanded after the putsch, but they were reformed straight after Hitler's release. Although it was set up as this personal bodyguard protection to Hitler, it was still a subordinate part of the SA. This was something that Himmler really did not like at all. Despite this knowledge of being a subordinate unit to the SA, the members of the SS very much saw themselves as part of an elite unit within the SA rather than a subordinate for it. The SS unit uniform is very well known, especially even now. And the members of the SS, even at this early stage, wore caps with Prussian skull and crossbones on it, as well as a field grey uniform which differed them from the brown shirt SA men. Later on, we do know that the SS eventually adopt the German army notorious black uniforms with the peaked caps and polished boots, which would end up becoming quite a trademark for that unit and mark them out as an elite force. It was a case that they took pride in their uniform. They were an elite force. They wanted nothing but the best and show that they were the best. When Himmler joined the SS, he was given the rank of SS Führer, or SS leader, and this was a huge thing for him. Whether this was out of ambition to be a soldier or to stand out within the party, he managed to almost achieve both, and this may have been an attraction for him to join the SS. A year later, in 1926, Himmler was promoted under the new head of the SS to be a district leader in Lower Bavaria. And as he was working in the SS, Himmler really proved himself to be hard-working and dedicated to the NSDAP. However, despite how hard-working he was and how diligent he was at performing all of his duties, a little bit like what we've seen in his early life, Himmler wasn't seen as actually having a very bright future within the party. Goebbels at the time, who worked with Himmler during this period in Bavaria, was seen as a rising star within the party. He had charisma, he had personality, he could bring people in. Himmler didn't really have any of that. Goebbels wrote in his diary that he really liked Himmler, and he called him intelligent and a good fellow who often gave him rides on his motorbike to party events. But again, Goebbels never mentioned anything about Himmler having charisma or personality. He's seen almost as intelligent and useful. But aside from that, there's nothing really there. And again, until 1926, Himmler was more or less functional and we could use him rather than viewing him as a leader. Within the National Socialist Party, Himmler's salary was 120 marks a month, and SS duties to him largely consisted of canvassing members of the Bavarian public to come into the party newspaper or secure advertisements. It was nothing overly great and wonderful that we eventually see Himmler wanting to be. Gregor Strasser eventually promoted Himmler within this year to Deputy Propaganda Chief in Bavaria, and this is where he started to work closely with Goebbels. At this stage, when Himmler is starting to be involved in propaganda and getting people to buy into the newspaper and subscribe and get advertisements, he is now getting the attention of Hitler, because Hitler was starting to see him as an important figure within the party. Still to this day, we are not really sure when Himmler and Hitler first met. There is an account that states that Himmler had a meeting with Hitler in September 1927. And in this meeting, he told Hitler of his intention to turn the SS into an elite paramilitary unit of the NSDAP. Hitler was extremely impressed by this, and so much so that he promoted Himmler to become the deputy leader of the SS and obtained the rank of SS Oberführer. At this stage, with Himmler stating that he is going to become more or less the leader of the SS and make it an elite force, he is selling Rohm down the river. He has to get rid of Rohm to make the SS powerful, and this is something that will eventually come into force. At this stage, he will have to get rid of the leader of the SA. By the time of Himmler's meeting with Hitler, the SA was in its tens of thousands in terms of members, whereas the SS declined from around 1,000 members to just under 300. And this was under the new leader of the SS, and Hitler saw this opportunity to outshine his superior. This is where Himmler started to show what was deemed to be known as his characteristic bureaucratic ability. Himmler decided to put his organisational skills to the test. He decided to completely reorganise the SS. In doing so, he decided to set up separate jurisdictions all across Germany. And this was his attempt to show to his superior that he was more able for the job than he was. And Himmler really enjoyed upstaging him, especially to Hitler. As Himmler was doing this, the NSDAP was expanding outside of Bavaria and becoming popular in other parts of Germany. Eventually, it was decided that campaigning really needed to focus in on Berlin rather than on other parts of Germany as much as it was. After all, Berlin was the capital of Germany, and in order to gain power of Germany, you needed control of the capital. In 1927, Himmler was assigned with embarking on a lecture tour in Berlin, and this was where he met his wife Margareta, who was Polish, and she was 34 at the time, while Himmler was only 27. The two eventually formed a close bond, and it's not really surprising when you hear her own characteristics. Margareta was very fastidious, hardworking, and anti-Semitic. And if those characteristics sound familiar, it's probably because Himmler had the exact same ones. While the saying goes that opposites attract, in this case, when you're National Socialist, it's normally similarities attract more than anything. Just a few months after they first met on Himmler's lecture tour, she sold her nursing home, bought a chicken farm near Munich, and married Himmler in July 1928. So Himmler was not only getting a wife, he was also getting the chicken farm he always desired. 1929 proved to be one of the most important years in Himmler's life, and this was due to two reasons. The first was in August he welcomed their only daughter, Gudrun Himmler, and, not really sure which one was more important to Himmler at the time, but on the 8th of January he became the fourth leader of the SS as Obergruppenführer. Getting the title of Obergruppenführer was so important to Himmler. This was something he had always wanted since that first meeting with Hitler that is on record of him stating that he was going to make the SS an elite, powerful force for Hitler. We as historians and people who love history know Himmler as the title of Reichsführer SS. This was actually not a title given to him until 1934. However, Himmler, in his desire to achieve great things, still addressed himself as Reichsführer from 1929. And this really just shows you what an ambitious man Himmler really was, and his ambition and his motivation to achieve the highest he could is probably where his desire to climb up the ladder and achieve all that he did came from. And we've seen this at a very young age with him, even in grammar school and in university. It is with this ambition that Himmler decides to take things further, which we will hear about in the next part of this. However, one important thing to note is that the SS was still very small when Himmler took charge in 1929. With the SS being this elite political protecting force for Hitler and his other leaders, it gave him direct access to the top of the political party. With Himmler's intention of turning this into an elite force met Hitler's approval, it meant that he could start to mould the unit into what he wanted. For Himmler, he wanted to mould the SS into ideal Germanic warriors from tales he would have heard back in grammar school with his fascination of Germanic heritage. And these warriors would have had loyalty and racial purity and have physical fitness and courage which were surpassed by no one. They were not surpassed by the leaders of the Nazi Party, and they were not surpassed by the SA either. But throughout Germany, he wanted the SS to be feared, and this new uniform as well that we later discuss really helped to cement this fear among the German people of this force. And the acts they carried out really cemented this. And I think that it is essential to end this part off here where Himmler finally gets the one thing he wanted, and yet he has still not achieved the title of Architect of Evil. He is starting to get it, he is starting to mould his way towards it, but it is not quite there yet. The Wall Street crash will change everything, not just for Hitler and the leaders of the Nazi Party, but also for Himmler and his desire to achieve great things in the party for himself, which eventually turns into him becoming the architect of evil. So if you enjoyed this part, stay tuned for part 2. Thank you very much for listening to part 1 on Himmler becoming the architect of evil, and I hope you will come back for part 2.